Rabbi, would you pray for us, please?
Yeah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank you, God, for providing us with texts that guide our lives. Amen.
So last week, we were discussing what? Joseph and his brothers plotted to kill him out of jealousy, or, interestingly, maybe, as was pointed out, he was, in today's terms, on the autism spectrum and didn't realize what he was saying. Fascinating. I've never heard that, by the way, Deanna. It's a very interesting interpretation. So one way or the other, but his brothers plotted to kill him, but they ended up not killing him. They threw him into a pit, a cistern that was dry, and then sold him into slavery. I made the comment, there's like premeditated murder and selling your brother into slavery, and somebody said, oh, there's negligent homicide in between, fair point. And then we had some people reasonably arguing the brothers aren't as bad as we said. Could they have been defense attorneys? And then prosecuting a murder attorney said, no, he's guilty. So very interesting conversation. So Joseph is sold into slavery, a couple different groups. And then we pick up, he's sold to a guy in Egypt. What does Egypt represent in the book of Genesis as a country, as an idea? The great power, wealth. Do they have the same gods as Israel? No. So these are pagan gods, and they're basically the superpower of that region. What else? The Nile, so it's the cradle of civilization. It is that area is the breadbasket of everything around it, which we'll get to in the story later. But it represents extreme power and wealth. And then there's little tiny, it's not even Israel yet. It's a people that will become that, contrasted with this great power. Anything else Egypt might represent, Rabbi?
Well, we spoke about how Egypt represents sort of the worst of the big city, right? It represents all the debauchery and all the trouble you can get into if you leave your small town or if you're not tied to family, right? That idea. If you make it in Egypt, you can make it anywhere.
Yeah. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, so very high up in the whole Egypt empire, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. Notice what happened to his father. Who was his father, Joseph's father? Jacob. What happened to Jacob when he went to live with Laban and had all these sheep and goats and donkeys? Did he also prosper? Yes, there seemed to be some type of, at least in this lineage, a physical blessing that you do well, financially speaking. And Joseph has that same mark or blessing or whatever you would call it. The Lord was with Joseph, so he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. This guy keeps making us money. Let's promote him, and maybe he can make us more money. Seems pretty reasonable. Potiphar, the master of the guard, put him in charge of his household and entrusted to his care everything he owned. Pretty reasonable also. From that time, he put him in charge of his household over all that he owned. The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and on the field. So this is a lot of description. Everything Joseph touches turns to gold. That's what's happening here. So Potiphar left everything in Joseph's care with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So Potiphar is binge-watching streaming services, eating gluttonous meals, hanging out without a care in the world because Joseph has got everything and he's making him extra money. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. Does that have a metaphorical meaning there, Rabbi?
Well, I want to, the verse right before it, or the A part of verse 6, is it, right? Because I was looking this up. Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. It suggested, in one of the commentaries I was looking at, that the food he ate is a euphemism for his wife.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's a hint there in terms of foreshadowing. Certainly a young, strapping man like Joseph, who's well-built and handsome, has his own troubles to contend with as women throw themselves at him, right? But the idea here is that there's a hint in what Potiphar, in the description of that which Joseph was put in charge of. Everything is yours, but hands off my wife. Yes?
Is that a comment on Joseph, or is that comment on his wife, that he doesn't trust his wife?
It's not clear. We should say something just, the cross-reference for this is Proverbs 30, verse 20, which reads as follows: "Such is the way of an adulteress. She eats, wipes her mouth, and says, 'I've done nothing wrong.'" That's 30:20, which suggests that it's a concern perhaps for her, perhaps for him. We should just make a note that our note, much like our understanding of monotheism, has evolved over time. We spoke of monolatry, a belief in one God, but among many, and then it's grown or matured our notion of monotheism such that today we suggest that everyone, everywhere is speaking of or to the same God. We just use different nomenclature and different ways of going about it. And that way, what happens at Calvary, what happens at Road of Shalom, or what happens at the Islamic Center, we all are on the same page is what we've done. Adultery is another term that from the biblical period, when it says in the Ten Commandments, you shall not commit adultery, we should understand what adultery was in that ancient world. What adultery was, appreciating that there are three parties who are in play here or are affected, which is to say, there's the spouse who is unaware, there is the spouse who's cheating, and then there's this third party. Yes? In the biblical period, adultery was the third party, that is to say the other guy, having his way with a woman who belongs, if you will, or is the property of the chattel to a third person. And the crime is this third party doing wrong to the other man because he's had relations with the wife. Does that make sense? So you shall not commit adultery is an injunction in the Ten Commandments against having one's way with another man's wife. The wronged party is the husband. The violator is the third party. And we'll leave for in abeyance sort of the role or responsibility of the cheating spouse, the wife. Today we understand adultery to be that which can be committed by either married partner against the other, and the third person is just a no-good-nick, but hasn't committed a crime, or hasn't, right? They're not really party to the issues within that marriage. So just the notion has changed over time. So I don't know whether it has to do with Potiphar's awareness that his wife, given the opportunity, would conduct herself in a way, I'm trying to use every euphemism I can come up with, right? Or whether it's a concern about Joseph. I don't know. Yeah.
So Joseph was well-built and handsome. I can imagine he's kind of V-shaped. Potiphar is kind of pear-shaped. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, not a lot of subtlety, "Come to bed with me, lie with me," is probably a better translation. Is that an invitation or is that a command? It sounds more like a command. Like so Potiphar is the head of the house, she's number two, "Come lie with me, you servant." Yeah.
Isn't he still a slave? He hasn't been freed yet.
Correct. That's a very interesting point. And he's still a slave, except he's in charge of everything in the household, except maybe Potiphar concerning himself with the food that he ate, his wife. He's in charge of everything else, maybe other than the wife. So he's a slave with a very high rank within the system. So it's messy, but a great point. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. The slave is refusing the mistress of the house. No one is greater in this house than I am, which is a pretty crazy thing to say to her. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. Does she ever get a name, by the way, in the story? No, Potiphar's wife. Because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? That's the adultery type stuff that Aaron was talking about. And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, so this was not a one-time thing, this was awkward. There she is. I'll go down this hallway instead. Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her, lie with her, and even to be with her. So he's smart enough to avoid her, not be in the same room. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, doing his job, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak. Oh, that happened before to him. And said, lie with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When else did Joseph lose his cloak? When his brothers tore it from him, and what did they do with his cloak? Stained it with goat's blood and told Dad, oh, wow, this person must have been killed by a wild animal. How awful. Do you recognize this completely obvious bespoke cloak that you gave to him? Oh, that's Joseph's. Oh, he must have died. So here's this weird thing. He loses his cloak again. She goes up and grabs him, and he has to pull away and leaves the cloak behind and disappears out, except she's got his recognizable cloak, presumably a new one that Potiphar gave to him, because where else is he going to get a new cloak? He's a slave, after all. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and run out of the house, she called her household servants. Look, she said to him, this Hebrew, what does that mean, Aaron, right there in this context?
Slave.
This slave, this trailer trashy
foreigner.
person, not Israelite, not Canaanite, this Hebrew, it's a slur, has been brought to us to make sport of us. This outsider, let's just call him an illegal alien to get really like hitting it, came into our house and he's making fun of us. He came here to lie with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. It's a pretty compelling story. And she's got not witnesses, but she's getting people to agree to her story straight away. She kept his cloak beside her, evidence, until his master, Potiphar, came home. Then she told him this story. That Hebrew slave, you know she's wagging her finger, she had to be. Because whose fault is this now that she's been wronged? It's her husband's fault. You brought him here, jerk, this terrible person. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak and ran out of the house. Well, she's just insulted his manhood, his leadership, his running of the household, his judgment. He's got to react strongly. When Potiphar heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He didn't kill him, but just threw him in prison. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Again, the story repeats itself. He gets put in charge and taking care of things. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, just like Potiphar. It will happen again later, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Michael?
Yeah, my Oxford Bible says that with respect to the tale of Potiphar's wife, there's an Egyptian tale of two brothers.
Yes.
Which also tells how a man rejected the advances of his brother's wife, who then laid false accusations story, whether there are significant differences between it and the biblical version.
So everybody can hear, do you know that story? The Tale of Two Brothers is a name given to I call it a stock Egyptian story. And this part about Joseph and Potiphar's wife is a retelling of that traditional tale. And we do this, think of movies in America are just retellings of old stories. Some of the Bible is original, that unique, created by the author. Some parts of the Bible are adaptations from other stories. Here's one. The flood story is probably adapted from called the Epic of Gilgamesh, very well known. This particular is called the Tale of Two Brothers. The details in that story and the Joseph Potiphar's wife story are very, very similar. Now, one might say, well, why did they use that? Because everybody knew that stock story. And in this version, it shows how God has been active all throughout Joseph's life. It also serves to further the narrative along, to continue to develop the plot. So it's one more example where everything Joseph touches turns to gold. He gets put in charge of everything wherever he is, every single time, it seems. And it gets the next step of the journey. So he's in the cistern, sold into slavery. You got to get him to Egypt. So he's sold eventually to an Egyptian. And how do you get him to the next? Because where's he going to end up eventually? With Pharaoh, with the king. So now he's high up in the society, gets thrown in prison again, or a different type of prison. And then he's, because of this story, he'll get put up into prison and eventually make his way into the presence of Pharaoh. So it serves, I think, as a helpful device to move the plot along and to take a well-known story and slightly reinterpret it to give the how is God active in it. The other version, the Egyptian one, doesn't have that extra character in there. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, the Old Testament to me has never really shied away from using strong language like rape or even like assault. I don't know if this is just a translation issue, but is there any reason why she's actually saying these are big sport of me? That seems like kind of light. It's not as big an accusation, and it's like he's trying to force himself on me or something. It's like, I don't know. Is there any thoughts?
Do you have a... Oh, great. Much of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, uses very strong language. It doesn't hold back. It'll say rape, it'll say assault, and so on. In this case, though, Potiphar's wife says, this Hebrew that you brought into our house is making sport of us, making fun of us, playing with us. Why doesn't it say something harsher? And what might the Hebrew say to that? I think I have part of the answer. Do you have something?
Sure.
Yeah.
The translation of that in that verse that suggests he tried to make sport of me. Yes, the verse where we, verse 17. Earlier, it seems to suggest he came to do something different, which is to sleep with me, or he tried to have his way with me. This phrase, mitzachek, is the litzachek be, that he tried to make sport of me, is the same verb as to laugh, as to play. Yitzchak is right. Isaac, Abraham's son, takes his name because when they were told, the couple's told they're going to have this birth so late in life, a child, she laughs. So it's a euphemism, this idea of laughing, playing, in the same way as sexual intimacy is sort of entre nous, and there's obviously a risk. I'm thinking of, someone will help me remember her name. Ira Glass of This American Life, his mother, is it Shirley Glass? Maybe. She studied infidelity and essentially describes that if you're engaged in an activity with anyone that you wouldn't want your spouse to know about, you're traipsing into a realm that welcomes infidelity. And it doesn't have to be an actual physical act, to say nothing of a sexual act, to have violated that bond or that trust, right? So if you're having inside jokes, or if you're flirting, or if you're playing with someone in that kind of way, it's a euphemism for sure. That's what it's suggestive of. It hints at a sexual dalliance or an escapade that you would rather keep private. One might imagine that in the verse where it says, verse 10, and though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her, which is to sort of better safe than sorry. I'm not alone with someone else's wife, right? Remember, Mike Pence, vice president, got a lot of shade for the suggestion that he doesn't have meals or he's never alone with a woman other than his wife without a third person there, because there's a risk. Orthodox Jews practice the same kind of bordering or creating a boundary. So something's going on here that's suggestive that Joseph wouldn't want Potiphar's husband, or Potiphar's wife's husband, to learn of it, and there's something that she can now use against him because he was actually alone with her, at least in that one encounter.
Steve?
Based on what you said about calling him a Hebrew, this is the second time she calls him a Hebrew. And I think there's some racism going on there. That she says, this lesser human made fun of me or tried to have fun with me. Because it's right there in that sentence. That Hebrew.
That's absolutely right. That's part of what I was going to say. Remember, you've got this tiny people, not yet a nation. It's just a family to the massive empire. This nobody is playing with us. The empire does not allow that. It must be put down. Anything like that. That's part. And he's a lesser than person. He's a slave. He's not Egyptian. He's nobody. How dare he behave that way? I think it's absolutely part of. Jan, you had your hand up next.
She says he's making sport of us.
Making sport of us, not just me. It's you too.
Yeah, he's degrading you. She makes a point.
Yeah, and our whole household by implication. Margaret? So he's saying, so this non-person or less than person rejected her, which probably made her even madder, because she's supposed to just like, this is the command, you will do this. And he's like, no, I'm not doing that. And so she was mad at multiple levels. Plus she was probably hurt. Well, I guess I'm not good looking enough for this nobody to young strapping man. There's all these things going on. That was how it was expressed in the text, sport of it. Yeah. So the story, that part, Diana?
This cloak, would he have been nude underneath it? Or would he have had, or would it be like these my cloak with you? You know, like, just, I'm curious to know whether, like, what's the big deal of her?
You just made me self-conscious about wearing this cloak right here. I have pants on. You probably had clothes on. At least some type of undergarment.
Maybe.
Maybe. We don't know. Jeffrey.
He's like the great example of being between a rock and a hard place. He really can't get out of this because if he doesn't do it, he's going to get blamed for something. And if he does do it,
Yeah, he's between a rock and a hard place. If he says no, he'll get in trouble one way. And she's persistent. She keeps trying. So eventually she's going to get what she wants or she's going to go after him. And if he does it, then he's in a whole world of trouble in a different way. It's a no-win situation for Joseph on the surface of it. Nick?
One thing I see is kind of interesting here is that when she's talking with the servants, she says, he's been brought here to make sport of us. But then when she's talking to Potiphar, she's saying, he came to make sport of me. And what's in my head, at least, is like she has all of these relationships, right? She knows how to talk to people to get them interested in her problem, right? And with the servants, it's about making it relevant to them. And then with her husband, it's about making it relevant to her and him.
Yeah, I would say that Potiphar's wife is an extremely smart person. Yeah, I'll say it. I have this filter. Yeah, I can say this. Where I'm from in the South, there was a certain type of person, sometimes a woman, sometimes a man, that you could say is extremely manipulative. And they did not carry worldly power like physically imposing to punch you or a gun or even high ranking, but they carried this massive power in their person and how they acted within relationships. And they could get people to do what they wanted with stuff just like this. So this character to me is extremely believable. You grew up in Macon, Georgia. You know this person, don't you? Oh yeah, I do. It's very real to me. So this chapters 39, 40, and 41 are part of it. It's all one story, kind of three scenes, if you will. Chapter 40, sometime later, so after he's thrown into prison, the cupbearer, the wine drinker, wine provider for the Pharaoh, and baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in the master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" That is a wonderful open-ended question that allows them to talk if they want to. "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." "Oh, guess what? I'm really good at it. I'm a total natural." Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." It's like, God interprets, but you tell me the dream. Isn't that a weird thing to say? I can interpret the dream as God's servant or go-between or something. That seems to be implied. So the chief cupbearer, wine guide, told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph, without missing a beat, "This is what it means." Joseph said to him, 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you'll be put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me. When you get out of prison and you're back installed in your place, remember I'm the one who told you this stuff, and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. Not a negative here, it seems. And even here I have done nothing to deserve to be put in a dungeon. When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, "Hey, now do me next." He said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." This is what it means. 3 baskets or 3 days. So good so far. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole. That did not go how the baker had hoped. And the birds will eat away your flesh. Now what's the reaction there? There's no, "Hey, when you get out to be killed, remember me." There's nothing. The end of the conversation. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Rude. What did Joseph do, if you think about it? Did he get the cupbearer out of prison? No. He just told him what was going to happen. He gave him hope. I guess, a good thing to look forward to. He didn't actually achieve anything, and the cupbearer, wine guy, just left it there. I would be annoyed if I were Joseph, but probably not as annoyed as the baker was, because he's impaled. The story continues. When 2 full years had passed, 2 years after this 2 dreams, Pharaoh had a dream. You see how it moves and builds each place. He was standing by the Nile, the great river, a source of civilization. When out of that river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Like, whatever you ate before you went to bed, don't eat that anymore, is one thing. Then Pharaoh woke up. This, by the way, is an extremely famous story. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy ones. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret for him. So they may have been too terrified, or we don't really want to tell you what that means because of the consequences of telling you. So better to pretend we don't know. And all the gods, magicians, the power of Egypt was insufficient to address this. It takes an external God, external interpretation to make sense of that. That's part of why the Hebrew version of this story was written. And then the cupbearer says, oh, hey, wait, I know a guy. Oh, I forgot the last 2 years. Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants. He probably didn't want to remind the Pharaoh that he had done something wrong. And he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night. Each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams. He interpreted them, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position. The other man was impaled. Oh, maybe I get some good service around here. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Why would he do that? Partly it's practical, partly it's symbolic, I think. If you've been in the dungeon, in prison, you probably stink. You're probably gross, unkept, so you've got to be clean and presentable for Pharaoh. Anywhere you go nice, you want to be clean, dressed up. There's that. But do you think he's wearing a really nice cloak in prison? He gets a new change of clothes. Again, he's presented with this to it changes his state. So he went from became the most beloved son, recognized with a coat of many colors, stripped of his cloak, gets the new one when he becomes manager of the Potiphar's house, stripped from him. Then he's in prison again, nothing, and now he gets a new change of clothes. All these changes have this outer appearance. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. That's why would he say that? To God only give the glory. So it's not me, it's my God where this is coming from. Which sounds much more impressive, talking to a king, that this is not Joseph's opinion, this is from God himself. Oh, that's what a king deserves, not some nobody Hebrew, but like a real God. Okay, that's legit. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile. Notice how it's different than earlier. When out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. It's a little worse than before. I'd never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first, but even after they ate them, no one could tell they had done so. They looked just as ugly and skinny as before, and then I woke up. And then I'll skip this part, the grains of and stalks there. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh, one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good years, 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. So you're going to have 7 good years of lush harvest, and then 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. So this is very repetitive. Why do you think this is repetitive, Aaron?
So
how it tells the story.
It's repetitive in terms of themes showing up again and again. So dreams or clothing to indicate who someone is, right? You'll know him by the coat, such that when he's not present, that he'll be revealed in this way. And then there are redundancies where the story of the dreams is repeated a second time, and there have been variations. Or the language that's used is meant to reinforce this message that the cupbearer and the baker have similar dreams. Pharaoh has more than one dream that echo each other. Usually this is used for greater emphasis, right? A word is repeated more than once. Yes? Sure, all of these were originally oral.
So it has the same sort of repetition that you find in Beowulf or Solomon Roland or other originally oral.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
I think that's the next point. The repetition most likely makes it easier to remember when you're telling this, because it's almost like hitting a refrain, then you go to the next one and the next one. I mean, how many times did it say cupbearer and baker over and over? And this with 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows.
Or even, if you will, if I can interrupt, in the first chapter we looked at, 39, right? The number of times it says that God was with Joseph, or God blessed Joseph or the household on account of Joseph. Joseph did, as I recall, in the first chapter we read about the Joseph story, God doesn't appear. I don't believe so. There's a man in the field that Joseph happens upon when he's looking for his brother, but there's not an overt reference to what's going on vis-a-vis God making these things take place. Which is why, for instance, the young Joseph, whether he's on the spectrum or not, is seemingly taking credit for the dreams that he has, as opposed to ascribing them to God. And so his brothers hate him all the more. Now that he's out of the land of Israel, he's been sold, been taken down by the Ishmaelites or the Midianites and sold into Egypt. Now there's a recurrence of this idea that God is with Joseph, or God blessed Joseph in these various ways. In chapter 39, I think there are at least 3 or if not 4 different occasions when we sort of gloss over that because we assume or we imagine sort of a priori, because we're the omniscient reader, but we only know enough to be dangerous, as it were. It feels like, well, that's sort of an appellation that Joseph carries. This is Joseph, God is with Joseph. But it's a departure now that they're in Egypt, this redundancy or this refrain that God is with Joseph. It's going to culminate in a chapter or 2 when Joseph meets up with his brothers again, when they realize before whom they're standing that he not only is justifiably angry, or could be, but he has the power to met out vengeance, and they're now the weak ones. Joseph makes a very important theological statement that he says, don't be afraid, God set this in motion. If not for your having sold me, God's plan wouldn't have taken place the way it did.
Which you could say is a summary of the whole story.
Correct. So now that Joseph finds himself in distress, he's been taken hostage or taken as a slave to be sold. He's thrown into the dungeon. Now he appears before the most powerful individual in the entire region, the Pharaoh, and each time we have references to God being with him. It's interesting.
And no one in this family is a dummy. Remember, his dad was the manipulator, schemer. Joseph got a touch of that, because after he interprets this dream, he says, and now let Pharaoh look for someone discerning and wise to put in charge of all the land of Egypt. case you know anybody good, and let the Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance, skipping it, collect all the food for the 7 years of famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials, so Pharaoh asked them, can we find anybody like this in all of Egypt? I don't know. Do you know anybody? I don't know.
Do you remember when Dick Cheney was in charge of picking George W. Bush as vice president? And then said, I've met everybody that's been suggested, but I'm the guy you want. Right? Sort of like that.
Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, you know what? Since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. Joseph's thinking, oh my gosh, Pharaoh, you're wise and discerning too. How did you come to this conclusion? You shall be in charge. It's just like, we're all awesome, don't we agree? Yes. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. It is strikingly similar to just going into Potiphar's house. You're in charge, everybody's got to know it. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. You're my number 2 guy. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger, sign of office, put it on Joseph's finger, and then he dressed him in what? Robes of fine linen. He got his new symbol of office and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a I'm just trying to imagine this like original gangster look, this big, probably was a thin chain, but he had him ride in a chariot as second in command. And people shouted before him, bow down. That's impressive. He put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. So in case anybody's not clear, look at his dad gave him an awesome robe. Now this is the robe fit for a king. And the nicest car you could have, custom, that's what he's riding in. Look at his gold chain, look at his ring. This guy is in charge. Then Pharaoh, and like 5 minutes ago, he was a prisoner, a slave. He's still a slave, right? He's still a slave, just pointing that out.
But it's still dressing for success.
He's a slave, but he's dressing for success. Yes, thank you, Allison. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt. Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. It's like, whoa. So he got an Egyptian woman as his wife, and it was the daughter of a priestess of Egypt. That was unexpected, at least to me. And he's like, okay, marries her, has 2 kids. Do you remember what his Hebrew name means? I can't remember that right now. Zaphenath-Paneah?
No, I don't know.
I looked that up. And Joseph went throughout all the land of Egypt. He was 37 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. When was he thrown into slavery? Or the cistern, and then sold into slavery? 20 years. 20 years from being in the pit, thrown in by his brothers, to now. Basically his whole life, he doubled for how old he was. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. The land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years, stored it. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. He stored huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much he stopped keeping records. He had so much money, he didn't even count it anymore. I think of Scrooge McDuck, like skiing down his mountains of gold and $1,000 bills. That's what he's doing there. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh. He said, it's because God has made me forget all the trouble of my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it's because God made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Now, it's one thing to have a dream and interpret it, but he's also right. Because the 7 years of abundance could have just kept going. But in fact, the 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph said. So now he looks really smart and wise and discerning. There was famine in all other lands, but in the whole of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. The Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, does that mean just Egypt? The whole basically area. Joseph opened all the storehouses and he gave it away out of the goodness of his heart. No. He sold it, probably at a pretty high profit margin, because they're all hungry and will pay whatever. He opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for famine was severe throughout Egypt, and the whole world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. And so everybody, that actually moves the story along again, because guess where they're all so hungry? Back where did Joseph come from?
Canaan.
The land of Canaan. They're hungry over there. They're hungry in the whole known world. And who's the only place that's got food? Egypt. Do the brothers of Joseph know that Joseph is in charge? No way of knowing that. But they know they've got to go to Egypt to get food or they're all going to starve. And so that puts Joseph into this extreme position of power and prestige and all these other things. And there he is. There the story ends. Do you think Pharaoh's happy? Yeah, he got much, much richer, more powerful, because the whole world depends on him. What else? Other thoughts, comments about this? Nick?
Could someone comment on the names here, like Potiphar and then Potipharah? Is there some sort of connection?
Yes, it's his wife or his
That
daughter.
is his wife? Okay, that's...
Yeah.
Michael?
Forget my curiosity about gruesome details, but I have a minor translation issue. Your handout talks about Pharaoh's impaling malefactors, but my Oxford Bible says that he hung him from a pole. I would be curious to know whether either of these modes of execution are parallel in Hebrew scriptures, or are they presented here as peculiarly barbaric customs, not common to Israeli culture. Do the rabbis have anything to say about this fact?
I don't know the answer to that. I'll look it up and I'll let you know next week. The question was that Michael's translation that he's using doesn't say that the baker was impaled, but was rather hanged from a pole. One says he was impaled on the pole, the other suggests he was hanged from it. And Michael's question is there a discrepancy or difference of meaning there? And have the rabbis explored that? And I'll get back to you on that. It's an interesting question.
One thing, Michael, it probably is more likely the hanged part, because in the story there is, your heads will be lifted up. And one will be lifted up like, oh, I'm free man again. And the other one's lifted up because his head's in a noose. Yeah, the crucifixion was a peculiarly Roman thing, extremely brutal, and meant to be kind of like in the Old West. You could have somebody hanging there, look, this is what happens to you if you steal cattle or whatever you do. You'll be punished and hang there for the world to see.
Every culture had its very worst punishment in the ancient world, but I do think I remember the Persians did practice and that's really put on his life. That's the Persians, not the
Persians, not the Egyptians, impaled people.
That every culture had a worst punishment. And the Persians impaled people, his suggestion, was that in fact the favored means of executing someone dramatically in Egypt. We'll get back to you. Look it up, we'll get back to you. Okay?
Any last questions? All right, thank you all very much.